Hey, folks, you're listening to the free version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. There are thousands of you who listen every week. We appreciate your listening, but you're missing out. We've got 2/3 more of a show to share with you every week. And you can help support this program, keep it alive. Look, we don't get much revenue from radio these days. We don't get much revenue from advertising on the free show. We get our revenue from folks like you who decide to support independent media and sign up at rofpodcast.com. When you sign up, you'll get the full show, commercial free. You'll also get access to all of our archives. But most importantly, you will keep this program humming along week in, week out. That's rofpodcast.com. Thanks so much for your listening and your support. Welcome to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Today on Ring of Fire, investigative journalist Renee Ebersol will be here to discuss her latest piece in The Nation magazine. Did Monsanto ignore evidence linking its weed killer to cancer? Marshall Allen from ProPublica will be here to discuss the latest article in his series to expose massive waste in our for-profit medical system. Heather Digby Parton from Salon.com will be here to run down most important news stories from the past week. And the managing editor of TYT Investigates, Jonathan Larsen, stopped by to fill us in on the Republican tax plan to enrich the 1% and the history of repatriation of foreign profits under George W. Bush and how it relates to Trump. Don't forget, you can go to rofpodcast.com and sign up for the free 1-hour version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. And if you want the full show without commercials, become a member. That's the best way to support this program. That's rofpodcast.com. Here to help me make some sense of another insane week in news, Heather Parton from Salon, or as you may know her from her blog, Hullabaloo, Digby. So, Heather, depending on who you listen to this week, and I guess maybe there is also a range of perspectives on this. Jeff Flake, we should be already chiseling his face into Mount Rushmore. He gave a historical speech on the floor of the Senate. He wrote a historical opinion in the New York Times. Or the other position that I will concede right up front is, who cares? Meaningless, except for in some very narrow instances. And this was not a profile in courage. It was rather a profile in somewhat cowardice and in brand proposition reinforcement. But give me your, and of course, and I guess I should explain to our audience, what we're talking about is Jeff Flake announced this week on Tuesday, in a very surprise announcement, that he was not going to seek re-election. He was looking at a very tough race, probably had internal polling that showed the race was tougher than we imagined. And he decided to not run for re-election and announced that things are not normal. The president's not normal. The president is bad. People should not be silent about it. And then he followed up in interviews by saying, no, he's definitely not seeking impeachment. So, who cares? Or do you have a different opinion?
Well, I'm probably a little bit more sympathetic to people like Flake than maybe a lot of my progressive folks are. Let me preface this by saying I totally get it. Jeff Flake is a far-right Arizona Republican who has voted against everything that I care about. He is not someone that I have any affinity for on a political or policy level. I believe that he and John McCain and Bob Corker and George W. Bush and everybody else in the Republican Party enabled the situation. They laid the groundwork for Donald Trump and bear tremendous responsibility. So just getting that out there, I am stipulating all of that stuff. I don't feel in the least bit sorry or sympathetic for any of those people. However, on a practical level, I do think it is useful just to save the country and maybe the world to have some Republicans standing up and saying some of this stuff out loud, however belated, however, ridiculously kind of lame that it all seems. I still think it's better to have some of them saying it than not. I mean, that's really the limit of my of my admiration, which is just, I think that in order to rein in Donald Trump, or at the very least start to begin to show the Republican Party itself, a reflection of itself, in which you have some people who are conservatives and have been, their alleged champions all these years. I mean, Jeff Flake, Mr. NRA, John McCain never met a war he didn't like. Bob Corker, I mean, he never met a tax cut he didn't like. I mean, these are not people who have ever been known.
Nor a race-baiting campaign,
Absolutely. One of the ugliest race-baiting campaigns that I've seen in modern times. So these are not good guys by our reckoning, but by a few people in the Republican Party who could theoretically maybe sit out an election in 2018 or vote for someone else in the 2020 primary, or potentially, start to, write some letters or say something somewhere. This strikes me as being something somewhat useful. I mean, I don't think that it's going to change anything, and frankly, I think the party is probably already too far gone to change. But nonetheless, we have elections to win. We have one coming up in a year, and having Jeff Flake say this, I think, is something that could be useful, perhaps in television ads, that there are ways for the Democrats to take advantage of this, and that maybe on the margins there are some Republicans out there. I mean, I saw a focus group on CNN last week where it was about half and half. Half of them are Tea Party people going, well, we didn't vote for a pope. We voted for someone to get things done. But the other half going, I don't know. I came of age back in the 90s, and we said a lot about character, and this guy's not showing character. If that rift can be leveraged, even in the smallest way, this is a very closely divided country. It may make the difference in elections, and that is everything, because I don't see impeachment coming down the road. I mean, I think it'd be great if Jeff Flake said it, or any of these guys, or the 25th Amendment, or any other way of getting Donald Trump out of there. But, assuming they're not there yet, maybe the Mueller investigation will turn up something that will flip that switch. I don't know. But in the meantime, elections are what we have, and that is what I'm looking at. So, I realize I sound a little wishy-washy here, but I'm trying to look at this in, how do we save ourselves? And any tool that we have to do it, I think, is useful. And I don't give a damn about the Republican Party, whatever their issues are. But, they are a major party. They are the other major party from the Democrats, and they have to be reckoned with one way or the other. So, let them have this battle and see if maybe a few Republican voters can be peeled off.
Well, all right, we're going to take a break here, but I will say this. I agree with you. Obviously, I agree that none of these people deserve our forgetting, who they are politically in our society. And I do also agree with you that the question is the one of practicality and one of efficacy in terms of our goals as people in the left of center, and of just being normal human beings with Donald Trump as our president. With all that said, I actually think praising Jeff Flake runs contrary to that agenda, and we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I'll tell you why. My name is Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking with the great Heather Parton, or as you may know her, Digby.
Like a southbound train, here's a song for leaving. Don't you know the pain? It's a part of the healing.
Hey folks, Mike Papantonio's new book entitled Law and Vengeance, which is the follow-up to his critically acclaimed novel Law and Disorder, is finally out and available to you to buy. The book is a legal and political thriller drawing on Pap's experience both as a skilled trial lawyer and as a nationally syndicated political talk show host. The story follows trial lawyer Gina Romano, who was first introduced in Law and Disorder, on her quest for both vengeance and justice in a whistleblower lawsuit against a weapons manufacturer who developed and sold a dangerously defective rifle scope. Pap has built a story around real-life events that he's encountered as one of the top trial lawyers in America, where he's been fighting some of the world's largest and most corrupt corporations. Buy Mike Papantonio's new book, Law and Vengeance, today. Go to www.lawandvengeance.com. That's lawandvengeance.com. Check it out. I know you're going to love it. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder here with Heather Digby Parton from Salon. So Heather, at the break, I set up my my premise, which is, and I think you and I agree, that the only reason in any way to applaud Jeff Flake's speaking out, I guess, about Donald Trump this week is by assessing whether or not this is going to help I guess Democrats win in the midterms, and whether or not it's going to help stifle Donald Trump's agenda. Now, obviously, it's a good thing from, I think, a perspective of someone on the left that Jeff Flake is not going to seek re-election because it gives Democrats a better chance of winning. However, if Jeff Flake wanted to really make sure that that seat went to Democrats, right? Like I'm not clear on what Jeff Flake's agenda is here. He doesn't want to impeach Donald Trump. He's trying to tell everybody that Donald Trump is not normal. We can't normalize this guy. But he's voting exactly like he would if Donald Trump was Marco Rubio. He is giving the Republicans enough time in advance to come out and get a new candidate. I mean, if he really wanted to do anything, if he wanted any material impact from what he is saying, if he wanted any material impact, he would do something, but he's not doing anything. And in addition to that, I would say, if he really wanted to say, like, this is not normal, then he wouldn't behave in such a predictable way. In other words, Jeff Flake did not come out and speak against Donald Trump and then make the decision not to run. Jeff Flake assessed that he couldn't win re-election without it being extremely, extremely difficult, if at all. And then he decided to speak out about Donald Trump. And my concern is, by in any way giving him a look, he's going to have impact on Republicans one way or another. It's not going to be because you or I give him any esteem. It's not even going to be because the New York Times gives him any esteem. In fact, I think by the New York Times printing that op-ed, all they're doing is fundamentally misleading the American public that what Jeff Flake said means anything, because it's not going to change a single thing. There is not going to be a single Republican who deserts Donald Trump who thinks that they can win re-election. Just not going to happen. If they haven't already been critical of him, they're not going to be, and they're not going to vote any different. So in my mind, the only damage that comes is when we get Mike Pence. If Donald Trump decides not to run in 2020 because he's too, I don't know, he decides he needs to live a more luxurious lifestyle, Mike Pence is all of a sudden a hero because he's not Donald Trump. And Jeff Flake can step out and say, I was one of the stalwart Republicans and I will support Mike Pence because Mike Pence represents everything I stand for anyways.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that. I don't think that Jeff Flake's going to have any effect on fellow senators or politicians. I think they're all, he's a coward and so are they. I mean, I've called the Republicans the eunuch caucus for many years, even going back into the Bush years. I mean, this is not a group of people who tend to stand up, and make any great proclamation that's going to literally put themselves personally in danger. Everything you say is correct. I mean, Jeff Flake knew he was going to lose. Now, just, you do have to say one thing about Flake that's different than, say, Bob Corker, which is that Flake didn't vote for Trump, and he spoke out against him before the election, even wrote a book about how, what a horrible person he is. So he's been consistent, at least, in his anti-Trump agenda. But nonetheless, I mean, he of course, if he were winning, he'd be sitting there trying to smooth things over, just like McCain did in the last election, right? Became a hardcore, hard right, conservative, a culture warrior all of a sudden in order to get reelected. So this is what these guys do. I don't think that makes any difference at all. And I think you may be right about it. The New York Times printing, it may actually have the opposite effect of what I'm talking about. Because I'm talking about voters. I'm talking about There are some sort of, kind of old-timey GOP, let's say the 20% of the GOP who's not still, approving of Donald Trump. And they're, it's probably about 18, 20%. That group of voters who don't like Donald Trump, maybe there's some kind of, they still have some dignity left in them. And they're the kind of old George H.W. Bush types, the old-fashioned Brent Scowcroft types. If they don't vote for GOP candidates, if they look at this and say, you know what, Jeff Flake, he's right, I got to go along with him, this is so crude and so disgusting. And mind you, Jeff Flake didn't say anything about policy. I mean, other than immigration, Jeff Flake is as hardcore right-wing as it gets. It was all about tone and behavior, all of which I think is really relevant. I mean, I do. I think our president is an imbecilic, childish demagogue, and he scares the hell out of me with his behavior, especially the stuff in North Korea. I mean, the way he acts, that is a legitimate complaint. I'm not saying Flake isn't right in saying that or that it doesn't matter, because it does. And it may matter to a certain group of Republicans. I mean, I'm hanging by a thread here, Sam. It's not like I'm saying that, oh, my gosh, I have really great hope that everything's changed. I mean, all that stuff that they were talking about this week, that, is this a sea change? Is this the tipping point? No, it isn't. No. But on the margins, maybe it makes a little difference. And, I don't think any progressive or any Democrat has an obligation to stand up and applaud Jeff Flake. He deserves all of the kind of cynical reactions that he gets from people on our side. I'm absolutely saying that. In fact, we're in an era now with all the propaganda, fake news, et cetera, just, go with the truth. Go with how what you really think at this point, because that's the only, thing we have to cling on. So anybody can say whatever they want, but I'm just saying that my analysis of the situation is that on the margins, there may be some utility in it.
I think there is some value in it. I just think that those of us on the left, those of us who associate themselves with the resistance, do not champion this guy as a hero. One,
absolutely
it will add no value to his actions, and two, this is the type of thing that could come back around and bite you in the butt to anoint a guy like Jeff Flake, or frankly John McCain, or Bob Corker, or John Kasich, to anoint them as some type of legitimate arbiter. Let them send a message to the Republican Party if they can, but do not in any way enhance their importance to the larger body politic, because they are still very problematic. We got to take a break. Digby, if you'll join me in the next hour. My name is Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Just ahead, Jonathan Larsen will drop by to cover some of the extensive reporting they're covering over at The Young Turks Investigates. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours poring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America. Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. The Young Turks have launched TYT Investigates to cover big national issues such as wealth inequality and corporate power. Here to discuss a few stories they've been covering, the managing editor of TYT Investigates, Jonathan Larsen. So, Jonathan, let's talk a little bit about taxes. There is a and we should say that this process of the budget and then the tax cuts has been rather opaque. It will continue to be opaque, it seems to me. It is opaque for a number of reasons, not the least of which because the Republican Party is determined to get these tax cuts without any support from Democrats because the tax cuts are going to end up going to the richest amongst us, and Democrats, at the very least, nominally, don't appreciate such a thing. And so we have this very arcane procedure that is going to allow them to have a 50+1 vote. It involves rolling in their budget, which cuts from any number of programs into the tax cut bill. So we don't really have a full sense of what this is going to look like, even after the announcement, even after they voted on it in at least the budget in many respects. However, what we do know is that there has been a long time push, and this actually goes back, and I want you to talk about this, back to the mid-aughts, when I think both of us were still at Air America, when George Bush pushed a plan called the American Jobs Creation Act. There has been a long time push to so-called repatriate profits that American companies are keeping offshore so they can avoid paying taxes on them. They're just sitting there waiting in a garbage scow off the coast of the United States to come back to America. And we've got to let these dollars come back to America so they can bring goodness here. Talk about the American Jobs Creation Act. I think it was of 2005, if I'm not mistaken.
It might have been 2005. I thought it was 2004, but it certainly took effect regarding the 2005 tax year. And yeah, they brought back something like $2 trillion, $1.5 trillion, something like that, and paid a rate, not the going corporate tax rate, which they all said was absurd and ridiculous, but 5.25% was the rate of taxes that they paid on all that money, some of which, of course, wasn't even earned overseas, but they had just sort of worked their books or done inversions where their corporations were headquartered overseas for tax purposes, so that even if some of the money was earned in the U.S., on paper it was earned overseas, so now they could pay a 5.25% tax rate on it. And the language in the bill, let me back up. So we actually just did some reporting at TYT where we talked to members of the Council of Economic Advisors and the National Economic Council and the Joint Committee on Taxation. We talked to people who were in on that process, that legislative and policy process, before it got done. And they said at the time, beforehand, these are Bush economic people now, remember, they said at the time, either I don't think this is going to create jobs or this is not going to create jobs. And they
so there were two options.
Go ahead,
it's unlikely that it's going to create jobs, or it's definitely not going to create jobs. And we should say that obviously it was sold to the American public as the American Jobs Creation Act. The argument was it's going to create jobs. And what's fascinating about...
I don't know where you come out with that. Well, I guess some people read into that.
Well, and what's fascinating about your reporting is, if I remember correctly, George Bush, only months ago, came out and claimed that he got duped, that he was told this was going to create jobs. And presumably, he must have been just listening to the folks at like Hewlett-Packard who were pushing this and not his own economic council people.
Well, it turned out, we found out that he did have some skepticism about this thing beforehand, but it seems to have been based primarily on the idea that you shouldn't change the tax rules on income that's already been earned. In other words, that's not fair, is the idea, that it shouldn't be grandfathered in that way. But I do think that the Bush administration, to Bush's credit, I think had some degree of skepticism. And so the language of the actual bill did say this is to be used for this, not this, not this. Well, it was used for this, not this.
So in other words, it was supposedly
there's no enforcement mechanism.
It was supposedly these tax savings supposed to be used to create jobs or go into R&D, and it ended up going just to stock buybacks or to dividends for shareholders.
As well as executive compensation. But yeah, the lion's share certainly was buying back shares of the company's own stock and paying out dividends to investors. Just gave it away to the folks at the top.
And, let's go back even further, because what people seem to think is that somehow this is a tax burden on these companies. My understanding is that that the reason why corporations are allowed to wait until they repatriate profits made overseas, wait to pay taxes on these profits until it's repatriated, was because the Eisenhower administration wanted to encourage U.S. corporations to build markets, to build a presence overseas, and that this was a way of encouraging them to invest overseas. So what was given to them initially as a tax break is now a complaint that they need to rid themselves from.
So what was given to them?
Well, what was given to them was the ability to delay paying taxes, to contemplate what they're going to do with their money. I mean, you can keep it in banks over there. You can earn interest on this tax-free, presumably.
In other words, they weren't forced to repatriate it immediately.
Right, whereas that used to be the law. So they were given this form of a tax break.
That I didn't know. Right?
Yes.
So this was an incentive for them to expand U.S. Corporate influence overseas in developing markets. That I didn't know.
Following World War II. So here we are again, and we should say, and we've got to take a break in just a moment or two, but we should say that as much as this has become a Republican policy, and as much as it's associated with the Bush administration, which it should be, this was during the run-up to the election, and I think this is a rather unreported story of the run-up to the election. Chuck Schumer was bragging that, I think as late as October, that he had Clinton and Ryan and Schumer, for some reason he was referring to himself in the third person, to come together on a tax repatriation scheme where overseas profits would be brought in to this country ostensibly to fund, at least in part, an infrastructure deal. Now, we heard Bill Clinton, I think, was on CNBC in the run-up to the election, echoing these sentiments that these corporations were going to get a tax break as a way of funding a large infrastructure deal. People can argue back and forth as to the merits of that particular policy, but this notion of giving corporations a break on their taxes that are on money that has been sort of, I guess, shuttled away overseas is not exclusively a Republican idea. But let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the reporting that you've done at TYT Investigates on Lockheed Martin and their supposed arguments about this need for this repatriation tax break. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to Jonathan Larsen from TYT Investigates. Folks, the Ring of Fire is sponsored by JustCoffee.coop. That's JustCoffee.coop. If you like fair trade, delicious coffee, tea, or chocolate, head over to JustCoffee.coop. Use the coupon code MAJORITY and get 10% off. There's free shipping. You have no reason not to get this great coffee. It's a great outfit in Madison, Wisconsin, which supported the protests there. JustCoffee.coop. We're back on Ring of Fire Radio. Right now I'm talking to the managing editor of TYT Investigates, Jonathan Larsen, about upcoming cuts to taxes for very wealthy folks. So, Jonathan, when we broke, we were talking about the broad history of the so-called repatriation of American profits made overseas or ostensibly made overseas. At the very least, we know that these are profits that are accredited to being made overseas, so that with the hopes, and this is one of the things that people talked about, what was also problematic about George Bush's America's Job Creation Act, or whatever they called it, was not only that it was a giveaway to corporations, not only did they not create American jobs, they gave out big dividends to shareholders, or they fluffed up executive and CEO compensation packages, or did stock buybacks, essentially for the same purpose. But it also created an incentive for these corporations to continue this practice so that they could wait. Maybe in some instances it would be a decade, maybe it would be a decade and a half, for a similar discount, a moratorium, a reduction on the tax burden that they owed, so they could bring this money theoretically back into the country. I would also add that two of the major corporations that had promoted the Job Creations Act as a job creator ended up cutting thousands upon thousands of jobs in the wake of getting that tax so-called relief. But you have done a story, and I mentioned you did one on Lockheed Martin, but you've also done at TYT Investigates some very deep reporting on both, it's UPS and in FedEx, on what their interest in this. Tell us how it works with them, because I imagine their international operations plays a big part of this.
Well, so yeah, we've done a series. We just started a series looking at Lockheed Martin, and we're well into a series looking at both FedEx and UPS. And one of the things that all three companies have in common is that their CEOs have been active participants in selling the message that tax cuts will improve the economy, in some cases explicitly saying that tax cuts will increase job creation. And their companies are also involved in lobbying for tax cuts. They belong to business groups that are pushing for them. But the other thing that all three companies have in common is, if you ask them, as we have, none of them are willing to say that they will create they will create jobs in the event of tax cuts. None of them have said that the company themselves will do that.
So let me just get this straight. They are promoting tax cuts because it will create jobs. But when you ask them specifically, what's your plan to create jobs, assuming you get a 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30% cut in your taxes, they say, oh, yeah, no, not so much us.
They don't say no, but they generally don't return those emails. But more to the point, when we go through these quarterly earnings calls that they do with Wall Street analysts, that all these companies do, they talk in great specificity about what they plan to do with their money. And it's not like they're hurting. All of these companies have billions of dollars in cash on hand. They spend billions of dollars on dividends and buybacks already. So they already have the money. So the notion that if only they had a little bit more, they would hire people, sort of doesn't pass the smell test on the face of it. But their plans, what we found very interesting was their plans, the plans they do talk about, are things that are job creation neutral or potentially pose a threat to job creation in the future. And that's, of course, as you know, publicly held companies, what they want to do, what Wall Street and their investors want them to do, is to reduce the bottom line. That means cutting payroll, cutting headcount.
Right, of course. I mean, this is one of the biggest problems we're facing, is that you've got a board of directors and a CEO who are paid, a big part of their compensation is a function of stocks and stock options. They like that because they get taxed at a more favorable rate than actual wages. And we know that the value of these stocks go up if the difference between the expenditures and the revenues increases. And the way they cut down those expenditures is they fire people and they get rid of them. And that drives.
And the way they do that, we looked at their earnings calls. We looked at their annual reports. We looked at their patent applications. So we found, for instance, that UPS and FedEx are investing lots of money in automation for everything from scanning packages to, we found a patent application from UPS for automated loading and unloading. They're also looking at things like driverless trucks. They're looking at drones. They've invested in companies that do drones. They've invested in companies that do things like, instead of having a fleet of 6 trucks, you have a fleet of 6 trucks with 1 truck driver, and the other 5 are sort of lassoed electronically to that first one. So now you only have to pay 1 truck driver. So they're looking to automate virtually every step of the process. They're also looking into things like the Uber model for delivery of packages. They're investing in these companies, where people don't have to even pay for maintenance of a vehicle, because it's just, imagine an Uber driver, only instead of driving a person, they're driving a package from the local store to the customer who bought it in their car, which UPS doesn't have to maintain, without health benefits for the driver, without it actually being a job. They're investing in companies that are the precursors of, a delivery system version of Uber. They're doing all this stuff: drones, driverless vehicles, outsourcing, all of it. They're pumping. That's where they're putting their money.
So the idea that they are going to be using this money to hire more people is laughable on its face. But it's also, look, from a general perspective, we know this is the case as well. If they're already sitting on billions and billions of dollars of cash, it's not like there's some type of magic number that they've got to hit before they start to hire more people. They hire people based upon their demand. Right?
Right.
This is basic stuff. In fact, the Treasury Department apparently had done a study into this, and because the results were not favorable to their claims that tax cuts would promote job growth amongst corporations, they literally took the document down off their website so that it wasn't continually embarrassing them. But this is like the classic case of, if I own a bakery, I'm not going to get a tax cut and hire more bakers. I'm going to wait until more people come in my store and I'm selling out my cakes and my cupcakes.
Right. And if you were in a cash crunch, but hiring additional people would help you out, you find a thing called a bank and you say, look, here's the model that I have for expanding my business. And you get a loan.
So, how broadly, we just have about a minute and a half left, but are there, in the course of your reporting, is there
military contracts? It's about getting those contracts and U.S. defense spending. So in the kindest interpretation, I think you could say that the CEOs look at their bottom line and they think tax cuts impede business in a sort of general way. And so they say generally, well, look, the economy will be doing better generally. And then it's not a hard leap for them to then conclude that that'll include jobs. But just generally, things will be better if we have more money. And so, but then when the rubber meets the road, it turns out, they're going to use it for something else. So even under the kindest interpretation, I think it's just not thinking it through.
Or their I guess assessment of things being better are just limited to those that are directly around them and including them. But I guess we will get a better notion of whether or not this is something the Republicans are going to be